downpour that could cause some problems, intense rain, lots of lightning. As I said, most places won't see them, just stay fine, warm and sunny with temperatures in the mid to high 20s, but an increasing chance of seeing those thundery showers during Friday evening, again, mostly in the west at this stage, but with more clouds spilling in, things just generally turning warmer and more humid as we head into the weekend. So Saturday won't be as much in the way of blue sky around. Still plenty of hazy sunshine, and many places will stay dry, but certainly for Northern Ireland, southwest Scotland, Wales and western parts of England, the likelihood that there will be in these areas some thundery showers. Again, many central and eastern parts will probably stay dry and still pretty warm. It's the humidity, I think, though, that you'll really notice, particularly through the evenings. A balmy summer's evening on Saturday evening and another very warm and humid day on Sunday. Again, there will be hazy sunshine, but also be prepared for thundery showers.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute? Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app, and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. The Mystic Megs of the Privileges Committee have claimed to know what was in Boris Johnson's mind as they publish their report, which would have recommended a vindictive 90-day suspension for Boris Johnson. Problem with this report starts with the chairman, Harriet Harman, because she expressed her views on Boris's trustworthiness before she joined the committee. On the Hoffman principle, she ought to have stood aside. The great lady, Lady Thatcher, never lost an election. She was forced out by her own party. The same was true of Sir Anthony Charles Linton Blair, and now for Boris Johnson. Why do political parties love to get rid of their most successful leaders? And more drama to get through, but this time it's in America, with His Royal Highness the Duke of Sussex and questions surrounding his visa. Homeland Security has rejected the Heritage Foundation think tank's Freedom of Information request for the Duke's visa details. Their director and former Thatcher advisor will be joining shortly. And the Home Secretary has confessed the government is on course to miss the Prime Minister's goal to clear the asylum backlog of 92,000 by the end of the year. 75,000 remain, and time is ticking away. But we have just surpassed 9,000 crossings for the year, and it's not looking promising. State of the Nation starts now. We'll also be joined by a consummate panel this evening. Cantankerous historian Dr. David Starkey and GB News senior political commentator Nigel Nelson. As ever, I want to hear from you. It's the most important part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. Now it's time for the news with Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you. The top story tonight, hundreds of people gathered in the city centre of Nottingham tonight to pay their respects to the 3 victims of Tuesday's knife attacks. The city fell silent at 6 o'clock to pay tribute to 19-year-old students Grace O'Malley Kumar and Barnaby Webber, as well as 65-year-old school caretaker Ian Coates. Earlier, the Home Secretary paid tribute to them by laying a wreath outside Nottingham Council House. Speaking at the vigil, the sons of Ian Coates thanked those who spoke warmly and lovingly of their father.
It feels like he's touched a lot of hearts over the years, more than what we assumed and knew that he had. So it's been really nice and heartwarming to see the messages and the people come out and talk about how he was when they were younger and how he's helped them. Some beautiful comments.
Barnaby Webber's mum, Emma, says Nottingham had a special place in her son's heart, and she asked people to hold no hate.
The monstrous individual who has shattered so many lives will not define us. And I know he will receive the retribution that he deserves. However, this evil person is just that. He is just a person. Please hold no hate that relates to any colour, sex or religion.
And Grace Kumar's mum, Sinead, fought back tears as she delivered a speech to the crowd in Nottingham as well.
She wanted to have fun, because that's what all students want. They want to enjoy themselves. And all they were doing was walking home. We're just walking home after a night out. And like Emma Webber says, this person must face justice. It just is truly so unfair. But I'll echo what my husband said yesterday. Be kind to each other, look after each other. Don't have hate in your hearts. Say prayers for my baby girl.
Meanwhile, the Vice-Chancellor of Nottingham University, Professor Shira West, says it will take a long time for the community to heal.
The people of Nottingham know that this is not what our city is about, and we will not let this single horrifying event define who we are and what we stand for. Our communities are united in grief, but we will draw upon the enormous strength of every one of us as citizens and our pride in our city as we come together to recover and start the long journey to heal.
Professor Shira West speaking at the vigil in Nottingham this evening. You're watching GB News.
The Privileges Committee report was published this morning, revealing its recommendation that Boris Johnson be suspended for a vindictive 90 days. That would have triggered a recall petition and potentially a by-election in his constituency had he not already resigned. Parliament on Monday will vote on the report's recommendation, and Boris could suffer the pretty minor indignity of having his former member's parliamentary pass removed. Unfortunately, this committee, a parliamentary committee, a committee of the House of Commons, was flawed from the start. Harriet Harman should never have undertaken the role of chairman. Why? Because she'd tweeted her views of Boris before she took up the role. There's a clear principle in a parliamentary committee set by Lord Hoffman when he was on the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords. Lord Hoffman, because his wife was a member of Amnesty and he was ruling on Pinochet, was deemed to be an unsuitable person to have on that committee because of the potential appearance of partiality. If that applies to one parliamentary committee, it ought to apply to another which similarly has powers of a court, is judicial or quasi-judicial. But to compound this, we discover that one of the judges is now accused of being at a lockdown party and yet felt free to pontificate about Boris. The line in the Bible about motes and beams comes to mind. And Lord Pannick. Lord Pannick is not somebody you would describe as a particular Boris or Brexit supporter, though he's a very distinguished lawyer. He represented Gina Miller at the Supreme Court against the government that Boris Johnson led, and he thoroughly outlined the problems with this committee from a legal point of view. What did he say? He said that the committee must establish intent. It didn't. That the witnesses should not be anonymous. They were. And that fair procedure requires that Boris, through his counsel, should have been able to cross-examine witnesses. His counsel was not. So the failure on these 3 points is a reminder that the committee is fundamentally political, not judicial. And yet it expects to be treated like a lower court and sheltered from criticism. It has complained that they came under pressure because there was public discussion of the committee's operations and the members of it. But they can't have this protection. It would be fundamentally undemocratic and doesn't meet the test laid down in 1978 when the House said, in general, it should exercise its penal jurisdiction in any event as sparingly as possible, and only when satisfied that to do so was essential in order to provide reasonable protection for the House, its members or its officers from improper obstruction or attempt at or threat of obstruction causing or likely to cause substantial interference with the performance of their respective functions. That isn't a protection from criticism. That is the normal back and forth of politics. That is what is known as free speech, which is the fundamental protector of democracy. The report was procedurally flawed, but it also took some great leaps of faith in finding Boris guilty. It said when he took the staircase to his flat that he must have known. Well, how do you know what people must have known unless you've had one of Elon Musk's chips injected into their brain so that you can find out? This is a speculative approach. I also criticise him for saying the rules were followed at all times. But I can tell you, as leader of the House, the briefing I got from my civil servants was that I should say the rules were followed at all times. It was quite clear that was what officials were telling ministers. Now, the last time Parliament behaved like this was in the 18th century, when John Wilkes was expelled from Parliament in 1769. But in 1782, the House of Commons realised it had made a boo-boo and expunged the orders and resolutions from its records. We'll wait for that to happen. Well, of course, I want to know what you think, mailmog@gbnews.com. But joining me now is absolutely the perfect person to talk about this, a man who crossed swords with Boris Johnson, fought an election against Boris Johnson, former Mayor of London, Mr. Ken Livingstone.
Hi.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Pleasure to be on. I love watching it.
Thank you. Now, I can't expect you're a great fan of Boris, but do you think he was fairly treated?
In all my life, I've never met anyone who lies as much as Boris Johnson. And when I said that to Tory MPs, they all agreed with me. Boris isn't really a politician. He wants to be a global celebrity. I mean, you actually look back, when he beat me for mayor, that 8 years he was mayor, he did virtually nothing. The only one thing he did, he built a cable car to nowhere, which is still empty today.
Well, he got Crossrail done and he led the Olympics.
But he didn't initiate anything except that ridiculous...
He got rid of your bendy buses that kept on exploding.
Yeah, I mean, literally. I think Boris just wants to be a famous celebrity. I remember... For 7 years, Boris was a journalist working at the Daily Telegraph. And I bumped into Max Hastings, who'd been the editor while Boris was working there. And Max Hastings said, never leave Boris alone with your wife or your wallet. And I thought, well, why didn't you sack him? You know, but then, he really isn't a politician. I mean, to have been the mayor for 8 years and done so little. And also, what did he really do while he was an MP? We were, I think, the last European nation to go into lockdown when COVID erupted. Boris is never on top of anything.
That's on the advice that was being given at the time. What the scientists were saying at the time is if you went into lockdown too early, people wouldn't put up with it. Now, they may have turned out to be wrong, but that was...
But why did
the
all
advice
the other
ministers were
European
being
countries go in
given
before us?
We were also the first to come out of it, to our huge economic benefit.
And I wouldn't be at all surprised to discover that we've had the worst death toll.
But we haven't. We're middle-ranking. Countries like Germany are worse than us. And we got the vaccine going, which was very much Boris's decision.
But literally, I mean, if you look at his collapse in public support, hard to think... I look back on, you know, Tory prime ministers like Heath or Macmillan, and they never had such a collapse of support as Boris has done. I mean, his poll ratings are abysmally low.
Well, when he left office, the Conservatives were only 4% or so behind Labour, and now we're, what, dozen points, sometimes 24 points behind. We were much more popular when Boris was in charge.
I'm prepared to do a bet with you. I mean, I do believe Keir Starmer's going to win the next election, because this has been this 13 years has been the worst government of my lifetime. I mean, I remember good Tory governments, competent ones.
What, Margaret Thatcher, you thought so highly of?
I mean, oddly enough, I didn't agree with her because she was abolishing my council.
You're abolishing your council, that's right.
But then what was odd about that, just before the mayoralty was created, we were at a party, and she staggered up to me on her crutches and said, you must run for mayor. And I thought, well, why did you abolish the GLC? How do you want me to run for mayor?
Well, that may have been because it upset the Labour Party, which it did at the time, didn't it? But there was William Hague's wonderful line about the day mayor and the night mayor.
Yeah. But you see, back in 81, when I became the leader of the GLC, there was all this nonsense in the media that I was an agent of the Soviet Union. I was supporting the IRA's bombing campaign. And, of course, unless you're rich, you can't sue. I mean, I went off and saw a lawyer, and she said to me, well, by the time we get to court, you'll have to have spent £100,000. It's just hopeless.
But to get back to the privileges report, do you think it was wise of Harriet Harman, after she had tweeted her views, to serve as chairman? Doesn't that make it easy for somebody like me to say, look, this cannot be a fair tribunal, when the chairman revealed her view before hearing the evidence?
Well, I've always respected and trusted. She came into politics to do things, not to promote herself. You could argue that it is a mistake that she chaired it, but I suspect she did it really well, and she's honest. I haven't, of course, read the report. I'm looking forward to, at some point, being able to do that. But literally, I suspect that report is going to turn out to be overwhelmingly true.
Well, I have read the report, and there are bits of it that I think are actually really quite speculative and don't apply the standard of proof that you would expect.
During the 3 years of the lockdown, I just obeyed the rules. I stayed at home, hoping waiting for my wife to get home from work, and that was it. And it wasn't just I was doing that because that was the rules that had been brought in. I knew if you get the COVID at my age, there's a 1 in 12 chance of dying, so I was quite happy to stay at home. I didn't want my kids to have to bury me this year.
But the Prime Minister had to be at work during this period. That's the strange thing about it, and something I think the report doesn't understand, that in Downing Street, you weren't having a leaving event as such. At the end of the working day, you were saying goodbye. You had people who were in the office anyway, whereas what the government was telling people not to do was to invite people into the office to have a leaving do or whatever. It's people who were there regardless for work.
All those parties that he did preside over was completely unacceptable. And literally, I just spent 3 years barely ever seeing my kids, and literally those parties were illegal. But also, they were a risk.
Well, there's only one where the police found Boris Johnson was at a party that was improper whilst he was there.
He were, and they'll dig those up at some point.
Well, that's pretty speculative, and that wasn't in front of the Privileges Committee.
No.
So it seems to me that it's going much further than the police went, and the police, of course, go to the criminal standard of proof, and this is just a balance of probabilities.
No Prime Minister has ever been fined by the police before. This is unprecedented.
Yes, but that's not to say that every Prime Minister was perfectly behaved. I mean, you could think of Lloyd George, you could think of Walpole. Certainly knew how to use the system of government to his own benefit.
Yes, but then I think of wonderful ones like Clement Attlee, that post-war Labour government. He was honest.
Absolutely.
And he created, for you and me, he created the best quality of life in British history.
Well, I wouldn't agree with that. That's rather a different discussion. I think that socialism in the 1950s caused us a lot of problems. But thank you.
It created... everything got better. That post-war Labour government, I mean, that it was only there for 6 years. But then when the Tories came back, they carried on.
Everything got better once we got a Tory government in 1951. But that's another discussion. I'm so pleased to have Ken Livingstone on, former combatant with Boris Johnson. But as always, I want to hear your thoughts. mailmog@gbnews.com. Coming up, why is it that political parties get rid of their most successful leaders? Thatcher, Blair and now Boris. Well, with me after the break is State of the Nation's favourite cantankerous historian, as well as Britain's longest-running political editor. And don't forget, Ben Habib will be joining me as the government's woes over asylum backlogs begin to become a backlog of their own.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Stuart says, the left seems to be frothing at the mouth at Boris's downfall and are obsessed with calling him a liar. However, what they seem to forget is Tony Blair's dubious intelligence dossier on Saddam Hussein, which destabilised a region and has cost countless lives. Jill says it's now done. Enough. It's time to move on to pressing issues that affect most of the public that voted Conservative. Otherwise, public patience will wane rapidly. And John says, criminal outcome. Unfortunately, Boris being Boris made himself an easy target. He will be back, as I think he himself said. Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair, Boris Johnson. What do these three denizens of Downing Street have in common? They were all electoral sensations, and they were all mercilessly driven out of office by their own parties. What drives parties to take such a seemingly illogical direction? Is it fear, envy, political fatigue? Whichever side of the political spectrum you find yourself on, this trend is electorally unwise. So what does history tell us about the way parties treat their leaders? Well, I'm joined by my esteemed panel, historian Dr. David Starkey and GB News senior political commentator and Britain's longest-serving political editor, who witnessed all the aforementioned demises, Nigel Nelson and Dr. David Starkey. Nigel, Boris was actually in many ways very successful. He saw off Jeremy Corbyn, he got Brexit done, he got us going on Ukraine, and he got us through COVID, and won a majority of 80. Isn't it odd that a party then defenestrates him? Because that's what really happened rather than this report.
I think that what tends to happen with prime ministers is that they misjudge the public, misjudge the public mood. So in Boris's case, Partygate really did play badly with the public, and that's where everything starts. And if you go through prime ministers from Margaret Thatcher, she got the poll tax wrong, thinking that people would love it. John Major is the exception. I don't think he got anything hugely wrong, but it was 18 years of Tory rule, time to move on. And then you work down Tony Blair, it was the Iraq War. Gordon Brown then doesn't call an election early enough. Theresa May calls one too early.
But it's the three I'm looking at. It's Thatcher, Blair and Boris, because they win great election results. Major doesn't, Brown doesn't, but those three do.
Oh, but there's a huge, huge difference, which is simply chronology. Two of them are in office for a decade. One is in office for 24 months, or whatever it is. And I think that points to an absolutely fundamental difference, which is broadly, Boris could do big picture, he couldn't do detail. And the catastrophe, of course, was that COVID needed detail. You had to have somebody who was visibly a manager. You see, I think you've left out the obvious comparison, which actually is before even you or I were around. So, we're going back almost into prehistory.
I thought we might be.
It's David Lloyd George. I mean, Lloyd George is an exact parallel in two senses. The first is Lloyd George rises above all because of the failure of the previous Prime Minister, Asquith, and a real war situation. COVID was, of course, a phony war, but more interestingly, of course, the chaos in Parliament actually meant that Brexit was a quasi-war situation, and you resort to similarly extreme techniques to deal with it. But the problem was, of course, the second coming of Lloyd George when he wins the post-war election, the coupon election, and survives barely 2 years. So here is a man who literally dominates the political scene in a way which dwarfs Johnson, and yet 2 years he falls amidst a stench of corruption.
OK, but Lloyd George had destroyed his party in that time.
And I think Boris is doing exactly the same. I think I'm sorry, you are part of that process of destruction, the manifest disintegration of the Tory party into visibly warring factions.
But when in the 1919 election you had the Asquith Liberals and the Lloyd George Liberals both standing against each other, we haven't got Mayite Conservatives and Boris.
We're not quite there. But you see what I mean? The parallels are really striking, as of course is the sexual incontinence, as is the brilliance of personality, as is the absence of friends, as is the strain. I mean, obviously, in one sense, wildly different background. One, a man of privilege and Eton, the other, and not product of Welsh nonconformity and whatever, but similarly a fractured family dependent on his uncle for support. The parallels, and also wanting to be king of the world. There's this extraordinary moment when David Lloyd George first goes into Parliament, and he's first shown Parliament as a young man. Don't he says he felt as though he were before him, there was a building to be conquered. There was a place to be, just like Boris.
Nigel, are you going to go for the Lloyd George comparison, or is there a more modern comparison that we can make with Boris? Or is it just that parties are jealous of their most successful leaders and they have to get rid of them?
I think parties certainly get a bit bored with their leaders.
He wasn't there long enough to get bored with.
Even for the time he was there. I mean, obviously, I would have thought Liz Truss is the exception to the rule, obviously, by just being there for 44 days. I just think that every Prime Minister ends up making a catastrophic error, which means their authority either drains away instantly...
Or begins making a catastrophic error.
Or over a period of time.
Well, no, Liz Truss began making a catastrophic error.
But she lost the public with her as well. I mean, it was the mini-budget that did that.
Sorry, but Boris, the evidence is much... Boris is surely a very... Again, the parallel with Lloyd George, and it really is an absolute one, Lloyd George is brought down by Parliament. He's brought down
by the 1922 committee.
Well, the 1922 committee is invented to do it.
Yes.
Which is why it's called the Nine. In other words, and Boris is fundamentally the same. He's not brought down by...
Except Lloyd George was propped up by Conservatives who didn't want to have a Liberal running them anymore. And that wasn't true of Boris, that actually a lot of Conservatives, particularly in the country at large, are still very pro-Boris. He's got huge support in Conservative membership. And Nigel, you must see that.
Yes, but it's the public that actually provides the knife. MPs only wield it. And that's what I think happens in a...
And so you think the knife comes because of the lockdown parties or because of a counter-reaction to lockdown?
No, it starts with the lockdown parties. It starts with that the public were absolutely appalled by what they saw was going on in Downing Street while they were losing loved ones and not being able to say goodbye to them. So that's where I think it starts. And it's these kind of errors. David Cameron, it was the EU referendum. He thought he could win it. He didn't. It cost him his premiership. And that all the way through, it is a decision they make by misreading the public mood. Cameron thought that Brexit wasn't going to actually play with the public. It did. Cost him his job. Would have been the same way if he'd lost the 2014 Scottish referendum.
Well, that would have been disaster for the country. But I'm afraid we're going to have to hold that thought. Thank you to my panel. Coming up, it's His Royal Highness Duke of Sussex and questions surrounding his visa. We'll be hearing from one of Margaret Thatcher's advisors as a US think tank has requested details regarding his move across the Atlantic. Plus, will the government follow through on its pledge to tackle the asylum backlog?
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard. We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think.
Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often there will be difficult stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi, I'm Dan Wootton. You can watch me live on GB News Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. And did you know that you can also watch and listen live on our website, gbnews.com. You'll always be up to date on the latest breaking news, as well as enjoying the best stories, opinions and shows. You can even join the debate under our live player as you're watching. So head straight to gbnews.com on TV, radio and online. GB News, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your thoughts, which I'm reading from my electronic machine. Stephen says, I totally agree with all you said in your monologue tonight. Thank you, Stephen. Excellent. It was definitely a witch hunt and a stitch-up against Boris. The findings have so many holes in it. I was pleased to see you put Ken Livingstone straight on a few points. He really doesn't like Boris, does he? Keep up the good work. Thank you. And Gordon says, Boris lied repeatedly in Parliament instead of having the courage to apologise. I believe that people would have accepted his apology, but no, he just continued to believe he could blag it away when it was obviously to the most politically inept that he was telling lies. I wonder if that Gordon was Gordon Brown, because that's probably his view of the world. Anyway, in news from across the Atlantic in the United States, the Biden administration has been accused of an appalling lack of transparency over its refusal to release the Duke of Sussex's immigration records. Our estranged prince has openly written in his memoir about his use of cannabis, cocaine and magic mushrooms, which for anyone else would potentially create significant complications when completing a US visa application. The conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation, filed a lawsuit against the US Department of Homeland Security and demanded that it share the Duke's visa application to see whether the Duke was in fact a drug-using Duke or not. The request was rejected yesterday owing to the Duke's right to privacy. I'm joined now by Niall Gardner, Director of the Margaret Thatcher Centre for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. Niall, thank you very much for joining me. Isn't it actually fair that a visa application should remain confidential and it would be an invasion of privacy to look at it?
Well, thanks, Jacob, for having me on the show today from Washington. We're arguing that it's in the public interest for Prince Harry's immigration records to be released, especially in light of his widespread drug use that he admitted to in Spare, but also in a whole series of major interviews that he's given over the course of the last year or so. Harry has become a huge public figure in the United States, in fact, really a household name in many respects. He's very active on a number of causes in the US, and we believe the American public has a right to see his immigration applications, his immigration records, to establish whether or not he was honest and truthful in terms of his original application. And there's also the question as to whether or not he received preferential treatment from US authorities with regard to his visa application. So I think there's a lot at stake here. And the Biden administration so far is refusing to release any documents, which is why we're fighting them in federal court. And we do believe that we can win this case ultimately.
And what would the normal status be of somebody who marries an American citizen?
Well, if you marry an American citizen, you still have to go through the immigration process like everybody else. You still have to be scrutinized in terms of your application. And if an applicant has used drugs, then they usually receive additional scrutiny. In some cases, individuals will be denied entry into the United States for drug use. In fact, large numbers of Britons have been denied US visas in the past as a result of their drug use. So just being the fact, of being married to an American citizen doesn't alter the fact that applicants have to undergo the immigration scrutiny process.
But drug use isn't an absolute bar to getting a US visa. It may cause complications, it may cause further inquiries, which, for all we know, have happened. It's not something that, if you admit to drug use, you're simply not going to get a visa to the United States.
Yeah, so it really depends. So in some cases, those who have admitted to using drugs have been denied entry. In other cases, they have been allowed through after additional scrutiny. And in the case of Prince Harry, we simply don't know what he actually put down on his application. It's a complete mystery. It's being kept secret. But of course, Harry has admitted to very extensive drug use, which is why we're raising this issue and why we're suing the Department of Homeland Security for the release of his records.
So the department has said no at this stage. How many court cases can you take? What's the expectation of the legal action?
Yeah, so the original lawsuit remains in place. We expect that there'll be additional hearings during the course of the rest of this year. And a federal judge has stated clearly that he will rule on this issue ultimately. And so the Department of Homeland Security, of course, is stonewalling right now, but they will face a federal court in the coming months. And we are certainly fighting to win this case. I think we have a very strong case. A recent opinion poll as well, published by Newsweek, showed that over half of Americans, about 54%, supported the review of Harry's immigration application. So there's a lot of public support for this, growing public interest in the United States.
Well, thank you, Noel, and thank you for the great work the Heritage Foundation does. It's a really important think tank. Still with me are my panel, historian Dr. David Starkey and GB News senior political commentator Nigel Nelson. David, this is the issue of greatest interest to you at the moment, isn't it? Whether His Royal Highness put information on his visa.
I must admit, I was suffering from... There's a profound problem in controlling a yawn when you're on television. It really... It's a deplorable... It's also so ill-mannered, and your person has such exquisite manners, but I was feeling a sense of overwhelming boredom. The one point I'd like to take out of it is that although, like you, I enormously rate the general work of the Heritage Foundation, I think this savours of a kind of lawfare. It is you dislike somebody, you try and find some means of doing them down legally. This, in other words, is a rather mild version of what we saw, which is important, with Boris, which again is something we did not touch at all.
Well, I very much agree with that, I admire the Heritage Foundation, but this just seems a little bit mean-minded.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, Harry is entitled to keep his immigration documents private in the same way any other migrant into America would be. That's the first thing. The fact he made that he was able to go public about his drug use is interesting, and it suggests that he declared that as he was entering America.
Aren't you paying far too great respect to his intelligence?
He must have some advisors, particularly on immigration.
If he didn't declare it, he's being extremely stupid to declare it now. If he'd lied to Homeland Security when he was going into the States.
But also, from the point of view of the US, isn't it quite sensible to give a visa to a Prince of the Blood Royal from a close ally? It just makes life easier. The last thing the US wants is to get involved in this not very elegant fight.
I would have thought, but equally, of course, again, one of the key reasons this has happened, which we haven't discussed, is Harry has become, along with Meghan, a serious political, or a quasi-serious political figure in America. It is clear Meghan has major political ambitions. Remember, she, at Northwestern, acting is only a small part of her degree. She does international relations. Her ambitions have always been political, and I think it's perfectly clear she is using her present position as one of political leverage, which of course is why they're going for the Biden administration, because the range of causes that Harry and Meghan espouse now are absolutely central to the culture wars of the Biden administration. So what we're really seeing is heritage on the Republican right of America going against a celeb who is seen as standard lefty Hollywood Biden-esque Democrat.
And Nigel, the Duke of Sussex did say in his deposition recently in court case that the UK government was at rock bottom. So David's right to this extent, that he's becoming deeply politicised.
Yes, and if they're taking part in politics, even more reason not to be caught out with a silly lie. I mean, you know, friends of mine have been...
I just think you're attributing so much more sense than that. This is a muddle-headed lad.
But does that perhaps explain why the Heritage Foundation is doing what it does, that David's explanation is a reasonable one, that he's put himself in the political firing line, whereas if he had kept out of politics,
merely been a
much less
merely been a
celebrity, the Heritage Foundation wouldn't...
Oh, absolutely. No, I understand that. I understand why they're going for it. Of course they would try their luck. Let's see if you can actually get this document made public. My point is that I don't think it should be, and so far Homeland Security saying, no, we won't release it, is the right decision. We'll see what a judge says later on.
It's also very much part of the sense that they're trying to paint the Biden administration as one with secrets. There's the secrets with Hunter Biden. There are the secrets with Biden's own finances. There are secrets with, Washington is a great Chinese box of secrets. I mean, you go to Heritage, and the conversation there, there's always a secret. There's somebody, and this is clearly it's a game. It is in many ways a game.
And does it have any effect on US-UK relations? Does this become a slight sort of irritant that Homeland Security does not want to have to fight a court case in the US over a British prince? Surely that's just tiresome for the US administration.
I think it would be tiresome to fight a court case about anybody who is a British citizen. I don't think it makes any difference to our relationship with America. Broadly, we'd rather Harry didn't come back, so we'd rather hope that he actually did in fact tell the truth on his...
Don't you think a short jail term in a particularly unpleasant Californian jail will be absolutely perfect for restoring his equilibrium?
I wouldn't wish that on anyone.
I'd be very inclined to wish
well,
it on
I certainly
Harry.
wouldn't wish that on anyone. I think we should have a certain regard for royal princes, even if they're temporarily out of the country.
But he has no regard for himself, and he has deliberately denounced his royalty. I mean, this again, I'm sorry, you are referring to him. Again, there is a wicked hypocrisy about it, because on the one hand, there's parading of royal highnesses and dukes and duchesses, and on the other, there's a fundamental attack on the notion of monarchy, and this astonishing fact, again, my point about his dimness, that he actually wakened up to the fact that monarchy is hierarchical. Can you imagine the effort of learning A, to spell the word, and B, to pronounce it?
You and I thought that he should have made the oath of fealty to his sovereign lord.
I think, again, watching him on his knees with the king enclosing his hands would have been rather wonderful, and vowing to be man of life and limb. And, that... I think it was being now serious, switching from yawning and being frivolous. I think that would have been a perfect moment. We would have seen then, if he'd been willing to do it, that, as it were, that extraordinary sense of the personal tie between the King and the Prince of Wales. If there had been that, in a sense, we could have tolerated everything else.
Better he came quietly and left quietly.
Well, that's a good point to end on. Thanks to my panel. Coming up, woe for the government on its pledge to tackle the ever-growing asylum backlog. Ben Habib will be joining me live in the studio.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed. So I guess they've always been quite woke. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know,
All
Kate
sorts
Moss?
of Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Weeknights on GB News from 6 p.m. You'll always get drama.
Please stop, Michelle.
I know, yeah.
Please stop.
Should I just shut up?
Romance.
You like me, I like you. There you go.
There you are. Well, don't tell anybody.
Adventure.
Etc.
That's the whole point.
And action.
Sergeant, the big green, my superstar panel, they're already at it. They're fighting. It's going to be quite a show.
Only on GB News. Britain's watching.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Fridays from 8, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I continue to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You can get in touch with your male Moggs. Brenda. Brenda says, it is in the public interest for the Heritage Foundation to be privy to Harry's statement on his visa. Thank you for that, Brenda. Always glad to hear from you. Speaking at Home Affairs Select Committee yesterday, the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, was quizzed on one of the government's key migration pledges, that of clearing the 92,000-strong asylum backlog. While she highlighted some of the practical steps needed to achieve this task, she eventually conceded, quote, that there would need to be a substantial increase in productivity and output, something we've been asking for from the civil service in many areas. All of this comes as GB News has recently reported that Channel crossings have just surpassed 9,000 for the year, with last Sunday seeing a new yearly record for crossings in one day. So what does this mean for the government? And as we've already asked this week, surely things can only really start to improve once Rwanda is up and running. I'm joined now by the great and very popular with our viewers, Ben Habib, the former Brexit Party MEP.
Good evening.
Thank you for coming in.
Thank you very much.
How do they deal with the backlog? How do they get the Home Office to be more productive when we still don't have people going into work, we still have masses of working from home, and the Home Office was at one point even threatening to go on strike over the Rwanda policy?
Well, the great shame, I think, of their approach to deal with the backlog is not actually, in fact, to deal with it properly, but to wave through, this is the impression certainly that I get, wave through people who are on the list. So I'm sure you will remember Priti Patel's National Nationality and Borders Bill, which is now the Act. And in that Act, it created two tiers of asylum seekers. Tier 1, those who enter the country legally, and Tier 2, those who enter the country illegally. And last week, we had Robert Jenrick elevating Tier 2 to Tier 1 in order to accelerate this backlog. So instead of acting as a deterrent to people who enter the country illegally, the Nationality and Borders Act, as it now is, has actually elevated these people to the same position as every other asylum seeker. And the other thing that they've done is instead of having interview processes where you can actually quiz this individual on their background, where they come from, what their views are, whether they've got a criminal record and so on, it's all going to be done in writing. And, you know, I see that as a really slippery slope, because if it's all going to be remote, filled in by lawyers, it's bound to tick the boxes, and before you know it, you clear the backlog, but you would have done it by default rather than with scrutiny.
Well, one way to clear the backlog would be to have an amnesty and say all 92,000 can just stay, and then you've got no backlog.
Well, effectively, that's, I think, where we're heading. And that's tragic, isn't it, Jacob, that we could have 92,000 people, and I think the entire backlog's about 170-odd thousand, isn't it? But that you could just wave through 170,000 people without genuinely checking them.
Would it be worth doing that so that you could then have a policy that you might have a chance of succeeding with, to say, OK, what's happened before hasn't worked, we've had a system where people can get in, but we're not able to return them, we don't manage to get deportation flights going, let's accept that reality, but make sure that now we have the Rwanda policy up and running, that anyone new who comes in is removed within 24 hours. Because one of the problems we have is once people have been here for a long time, it does become unfair to remove them if they've been here for several years.
I think it's not just unfair, I think it becomes legally very problematic because they get entrenched into British society, and then you've got to convince the European Court of Human Rights that you've got a legitimate reason to remove them. But I don't, as expedient and as simple as your suggested solution is, it would never work because we don't have a policy that is adequate to deal with the problem that we're facing. And the real... Sorry.
Well, I was going to say, what would that policy be? There's the Rwanda part of it, which I think is a very good part because it becomes a deterrent. But what else do you need to do?
Well, this is the issue. Our whole approach to the small boats coming from France is through a position of deterrent. What we're trying to convince these people of is that they will not have a comfortable time in the United Kingdom should they wish to make that dangerous journey from France. But we fail completely in that endeavour, don't we? The minute they enter our territorial waters, they're put on a nice, secure British, either RNLI or Border Force boat, brought back to the shore, put in a 4-star hotel, given free dental care, free National Health Service, free food, and cash in their pockets. And then free access to, legal advice so that they can fight their asylum cases. And even if our domestic law has been framed so that we can send them to Rwanda or we can require the Secretary of State to detain them and then deport them, as the new illegal migration bill hopes to do, nothing works. It doesn't work, does it? And one of the interesting things yesterday from Suella Braverman was that she linked Rwanda, I don't know if you picked this up yesterday, Jacob, but she linked Rwanda to the success of the illegal migration bill. Now, when the illegal migration bill was first launched, it was launched as a holistic, all-encompassing bill that would at last deal with the problem. But we know there are problems with the Rwanda policy. At least so far, it hasn't succeeded in sending a single person back, sending a single person to Rwanda.
But that's because of the European Court of Human Rights and its de facto injunction. Until that's overcome, unless they use the powers in the Illegal Migration Act that give the Home Secretary the right to overrule that, there will be no flights to Rwanda.
But here's the rub. Section 51 of the Illegal Migration Act, bill gives the ECHR and obliges the Home Secretary to consider ECHR rulings, gives the ECHR a voice and obliges the Home Secretary to, consider what their view is. And of course, the European Court of Human Rights is the supreme judicial authority in the United Kingdom when it comes to human rights.
Well, sort of. It doesn't have direct effect, unlike the ECJ. So it is slightly different. It has to be accepted by Parliament.
Well, what are the chances of Parliament standing up against it?
It didn't accept prisoners' voting rights, which the ECHR ruled we should have, and some compromise was come to that basically meant prisoners didn't get voting rights. So it is possible to stand up.
It is possible. So far, the evidence would suggest that we haven't got the stomach to do it. I mean, there's a very simple way to deal with this problem, Jacob, and that is not to see it through a humanitarian prism, to understand and accept that these people are coming from France, their security and their humanity is assured in France. They are not at risk in France. They are purely, the minute they decide to make that journey, they are purely economic migrants. And what we've got to discover is the political will to stop them in the channel and make sure that those boats never come to shore in the United Kingdom. And we have all international law on our side to do that.
Well, you heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. France is apparently safe in spite of all that garlic they eat. Anyway, thank you, Ben. That's all from me. Up next, it's Professor Daniel Wootton, who is in Lee, and he's got the great Liz Truss with him. Are you going to be asking Liz what she makes of the Privileges Committee?
Oh, yes, I am, Jacob, but I don't just have Liz Truss coming up. I have the most incredible audience of GB News supporters, so I am absolutely delighted, Jacob, to be in Lee. They are a big fan of you. And tonight, Jacob, it is Liz Truss's first major TV appearance, and I'm going to be asking her everything with the help of my audience.
Well, that's absolutely brilliant, and GB News, Inley are the best, the tip-top best, with the great, redoubtable Liz Truss. So do say hello to her from me. That's all coming up after the weather. I will be back on Monday, subject to the debate on the Privileges Committee. I may need to be talking in the House of Commons on Monday evening on Boris's fate. This has been State of the Nation. You, dear viewer, have been Moggalicious, and the sun is shining in Somerset.
Evening, Alex Deacon here with your latest weather for GB News from the Met Office. Another fine, sunny one for most on Friday, and again pretty warm, but an increasing chance of seeing some more thunderstorms. Any storms this evening over the west of Northern Ireland tending to drift away. Most will have a dry night with lengthy clear spells, a bit misty around the coast of northwest Scotland. Later in the night, the cloud increasing, the possibility of some showers in the far southwest. But for most, as I said, dry and clear, pretty warm and humid in the west, but cooler across the northeast. Temperatures, rural parts of Scotland, well down into single figures. So a coolish start here, but for most, it will be, again, a warm day on Friday. For the vast majority, another blue sky day as well. But in the west, any sunshine turning increasingly hazy as the cloud spills in. And we are going to see some showers breaking out. One or two maybe early on in the southwest, but much of the morning dry. It's really in the afternoon and evening where parts of Wales and Northern Ireland could catch a thundery downpour that could cause some problems of intense rain, lots of lightning. As I said, most places won't see them. Just stay fine, warm and sunny with temperatures